at Winthrop University. I'm pleased to welcome you here to tonight's event on behalf of my colleagues who've been working to set up this series and on behalf of the university. So let me talk a little bit about some of the background here. Tonight's event is part of an 8-month, 11-event collaboration with South Carolina Humanities, Winthrop University, and the South Carolina Press Association entitled News Literacy and the Future of Journalism. We have additional support from North Carolina Humanities Council, the Newseum, the West Forum, the Departments of Mass Communication and Political Science, and the College of Arts and Sciences, and we thank them all for their support. This series, News Literacy and the Future of Journalism, is part of a national initiative sponsored by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Mellon Foundation on Democracy and the Informed Citizen. And the purpose of this is to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of the vital connections among democracy, the humanities, journalism, and an informed citizenry. Tonight's event, again, is Finding the Truth Among Competing Claims, and I'm very pleased to welcome to us Angie Holan from Politifact. This evening, we will have a survey for you to do, and we'll bring this slide back up. You can use your QR code or the tiny URL. It's a very short evaluation, but it is required by our funder, and we really do want your feedback, so please, please, please fill it out when the time comes. Allow me to introduce our speakers. First, we have Avery Wilkes, who is a reporter with the state newspaper. He is a recent graduate of the University of South Carolina's Journalism School, and in spite of the fact that he went to the second-ranked journalism school in the state, he's a great reporter. He should have come to Winthrop instead, obviously. He has been covering the South Carolina politics in the State House, but also the utilities debacle related to the failed VC Summer nuclear power plant. And before joining the state, he was with the Tulsa World and the Dow Jones News Fund and the Aiken Standard. He will be spending more time to introduce our main speaker, Angie Holan, who is the editor of Politifact, and we'll be learning more about her in a minute. These are all of our sponsors, including the partner of the Pulitzer Prizes, including we have been able to bring many Pulitzer Prize winners to campus over this series, and we're very excited about this as well. Our next event is screening of the film Spotlight, which will be in this room on January 29th, 2019. Sorry about the date. Right here in this space. And it will be for students who are interested in an approved cultural event as well. Okay, so at this point, without further ado, I welcome Avery Wilkes.
Hey, do I need to speak into this, or can you guys hear me? Pick it up. All right, cool. I'm Avery Wilkes. I'm a State House reporter at the state newspaper, cover politics, elections, that kind of thing. I'm here tonight to introduce an award-winning journalist and an expert fact-checker, Pulitzer Prize-winning editor Angie Holan. If you've heard the terms full flop or pants on fire used to describe a politician's claims, you're probably already familiar with her work. Angie Holan grew up in Louisiana and went to college at the University of Texas. She holds master's degrees from Columbia University and the University of South Florida. She's worked as a business reporter for the Mobile Press Register, a news reporter for the Tampa Tribune, and a news researcher for the Tampa Bay Times. By the way, that information came directly from her Wikipedia page. And I say that to note that she does have a Wikipedia page. It's not something that a lot of journalists get. In all seriousness, she is the editor of Politifact. It's a project she's worked on since the Tampa Bay Times launched it in 2007 to enhance the newspaper's election coverage. Since its inception, Politifact has provided definitive, nonpartisan assessments of factual claims made by politicians. It has a truthometer that you've probably seen if you're on Twitter or followed any of the 2016 elections that rates those claims from true to pants on fire false. She started off working as a reporter, and the project caught on quickly. She was part of the Pulitzer Prize winning team that covered the 2008 election, was promoted to deputy editor, and then to editor in charge of Politifact in 2013. Today, Politifact continues to be an important tool for the public in an era of aggressive spin, misinformation, and so-called alternative facts. Please join me in welcoming Angie Holan.
Thank you. That was such a nice introduction. I'm going to see if I can get my PowerPoint into full screen mode. There we go. All right. I'm here today to talk a little bit about Politifact, about how we got started, about how we do our fact checking. And then after that, we'll get to the best part of the program, which will be your questions. I believe there have been note cards passed throughout the room. So I love audience questions. I love getting to know what's on the minds of students, of future journalists, of people who are voting. We just came through a very intense midterm election. Our most intense work of the 2-year cycle, our most intense work is the presidential elections, which we get every 4 years. Let me paint a picture for you right now of where we're at in American politics. I've been with Politifact for 11 years now, and I can tell you it's the most partisan, polarized time that we've seen. A lot of people don't seem very interested in public policy or the issues. They're more interested in knowing which side are the Republicans on and which side are the Democrats on. And they either do or do not want to be on that side, very much so. We have these online platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, where people go to discuss politics or share political information. Again, it just seems like a very highly charged atmosphere where there's my side and your side, and we're not going to meet. There's very high public distrust of politicians in the media. I don't know if any of you have had cause to study this, but it's very clear in the polling data. Organizations like Gallup do public opinion polls regularly on the trust people have in institutions, and public trust in politicians and the media has been declining pretty steadily since Watergate and seems to be at all-time lows. And yet, for all the fracturing on the internet and the distrust, it seems that platforms and pundits have more influence than ever. We're in this highly charged environment where people can take positions as TV show hosts or as in talk radio. The pundits, they do a lot of talking, and they seem to have quite a bit of influence. So into this area, we have our fact-checking journalism. Some of my friends tease me about this slide because I call it a new form of accountability journalism. And they say, you've been doing this for 11 years, you're not new anymore. To me, it does still feel new. The methods that Politifact has been pioneering to bring journalism's focus onto the facts, onto public policy, I think we still need this in our journalism. Politifact is a website. We have partnerships with newspapers, with public radio stations, with independent websites, but we're first and foremost a website. We're web first. We're digital journalism for a digital age. And our mantra you see up there, fact-checking gives people the information they need to govern themselves in a democracy. We're holding those in power accountable, and our core principles are independence, transparency, fairness, thorough reporting, and clear writing. I'm going to get into this in some more depth here. But just so you know our story, Politifact was started at a newspaper, the Tampa Bay Times. Back then it was called the St. Petersburg Times. St. Petersburg is a beautiful city on the coast in Florida, across the bay from Tampa. We started in August 2007. The idea was that we wanted to do an election year project that would focus on fact-checking. The founder of Politifact, the founding editor, Bill Adair, who is now a professor at Duke University, he had a personal conviction that there wasn't enough fact-checking in politics. So we started this, we said this will be our election year project. If it goes well, we'll see what happens. Well, it went really well. It was really popular. People liked it, and we kept it going. For our coverage of that 2008 election, between Barack Obama and John McCain, we won the Pulitzer Prize. Since that time, we've published 13,500 fact checks, and we're on our way to 14,000. We have partners in 11 states where we do local fact checking. So we have Politifact Florida, Politifact Texas, Politifact Wisconsin. We do not have a Politifact South Carolina, I'm sorry to say. We look for partners who have journalists on the ground in the states where we go into. Our national team is 11 journalists split between Florida and Washington, D.C. And just to give you a sense of our popularity, we had 115 million page views in 2016. So this is a question I always get. Who pays for this? Well, we have a new business model. We were started in the Tampa Bay Times newspaper, and for a long time, we were just a division of the newspaper. At the beginning of this year, we moved to the Poynter Institute. The Poynter Institute is a nonprofit school for journalists that is actually the owner of the newspaper. We moved out, a little bit complicated, but we moved out from under the for-profit newspaper to be part of the nonprofit Journalism Institute. So we could, we had slowly over the course of the years developed a business model, and now we're independent, fully nonprofit, and we support ourselves. We do it through reader support. We have a kind of an NPR-style membership program we call the Truth Squad. We also accept online advertising. We get enough page views that we make significant revenue from automated advertising. We also take some grants and foundation money. In the grants, we stipulate that we retain our editorial independence. Only journalists decide what to fact check or what the ratings should be. And then we have syndication and services. So part of this syndication and services, some newspapers run our reports. We also have a partnership with Facebook, where we fact check fake news for Facebook. That also falls under the revenue for syndication and services. Okay, I'm going to pivot now to our method, our fact-checking method. Every story we write examines who said what and is it true. We have our published methodology. You can Google this, the principles of the Truthometer. It lays out in more detail. I'm going to go through the high points tonight, but it lays out in detail how we fact check. This transparency is really the hallmark of our work. We use original sources. We don't take people's word for it. We go and we get the report, the study, the data, the evidence ourselves. This is really key. And then we link to those original sources. I'll talk more about transparency in a minute. We have our ratings. Our ratings go from true to mostly true to half true to mostly false to pants on fire. The ratings are determined by a vote of 3 editors. Every fact check we publish, 3 editors read it. So if you haven't been to our site, I hope most of you have, but if you haven't, every report is a politician said this, this is the rating, this is the news story explaining why we gave it the rating. I'll have a few examples in just a minute. But know that 3 editors read every fact check and we vote on the ratings. We use experts. We're looking for people with deep subject-specific knowledge and a diversity of views. The experts help guide us through research that's often technical. So for the students, like you may have to write a research paper on something. You may not be an expert on it. You look at the research. We do all of that, and then we consult with the experts because they guide us and help us avoid any tricks or any kind of minefields. The transparency I mentioned already. We link to our sources and include a source list on the right rail of every fact check. When you read a Politifact report, it starts off with where the statement was made. It goes through that we decided to fact check it. It gives the context of the statement. And then the rest of the story is really the evidence that we found. We try to keep our reports concise, just to respect the reader's time, but we don't want there to be any mystery or uncertainty about the evidence that caused us to reach the rating that we did. The transparency, I feel like, is our best response to this lack of public trust in journalists. People don't want to be told, what to think. They want to see for themselves. And all of our fact checks have this level of transparency. We also have corrections, and we have a corrections policy. I talk about corrections not because I like to dwell on our mistakes. I certainly don't. But I do think that one of the hallmarks in this digital age of a reputable news organization is that they have a corrections policy. They correct errors, and they explain the changes. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of corrections. Most of them are fairly minor. Every so often, we find evidence that really changes our perspective on a piece that we didn't find before we published. In those cases, we pull the fact check, we re-report it, we re-rate it, and we archive the old version. It's a level of correction that I'm really proud of. I think that, again, I just think it's really important that reputable journalists correct their mistakes. And if you see a publication or watch a news show that never has any corrections, I would be very suspicious. Okay, now we're at the examples part. I selected 3 fact checks I wanted to talk with you about in more depth. And I think you can see this. This is from our website. This is a claim that seems to come around every couple of years. Members of Congress can retire with the same pay after only 1 term in office. We rated it pants on fire. And I want you to pause and just think a minute. If you were the fact checker, where would you look to prove or disprove this claim? I have 3 examples tonight. They're all wrong on some level. And I'm going to show you where we turned for evidence. But just think. I mean, again, I think this is something that goes around the internet every so often. I think on some level, I think people must they like the outrage that this idea gets. It's not true. They don't get the same pay after only 1 term. Okay, everybody has an idea. You're the fact checker. You know where you would go to find it? Okay, let's see what we actually found. Okay, so we went to a report on retirement benefits for members of Congress. It was prepared by the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, and it told us that no member of Congress is eligible for any pension unless he or she has served in Congress for at least 5 years, and then they only get a partial pension. I just selected a little bit of this report. If you go on the internet and read the full report, you'll see that they do get a pension, but it accrues over years, and it's not their full pay. They're forbidden by statute from getting their full pay. They only get partial pay. There's a lot of interesting things to discuss about this, and you can see how this fact might provoke public discussion about who gets pensions, who doesn't. I can tell you, I've worked in journalism in the private sector. I'm never going to get a pension from anybody. Members of Congress and federal workers get pensions. Members of Congress are treated like other federal workers. That's certainly something that can be discussed as public policy, but this notion that they get paid for life is just wrong. That's why we rated it pants on fire. It's ridiculous. Okay, next one. This is Jeff Greenfield. I would call him a left-leaning pundit, and this was from the beginning of the year, from February. And he says, in the rest of the world, there have been 18 school shootings in the last 20 years. In the U.S., there have been 18 school shootings since January 1st. We rated it mostly false. This one is really interesting to me because, think about it. Where would you go for a source on how many school shootings there have been? And just to tip you off, for crime statistics, we would normally go to the FBI uniform crime statistics. Those are federal numbers that are collected from police departments around the United States. But I will tell you there's no category for school shootings. There is a category for homicides, but it's not separated out by the environment. So then where are you going to go after that? One of our principles that you'll read about in Principles of the Truthometer is that we always ask the person for their evidence. So we went to Jeff Greenfield and asked him for his evidence, and he pointed us to a group called Every Town for Gun Safety, which is a group that says we're against gun violence. And we looked at their list of school shootings. And what we found when we dug deep, when we asked them for their evidence, what are these documented school shootings, they gave us a list that started like this. This is obviously not all 18 of them. But they collect any instance of firearms at a school. So any time a weapon is discharged at a school, they count it as a school shooting. So a man committed suicide in a parking lot, no other injuries. An unidentified shooter fires shots into a building, no injuries. We felt like that made his statement mostly false. Because I'm not sure how many people would consider a suicide in a parking lot to be a school shooting. So it wasn't completely false, but we felt that it significantly misrepresented the public issues at hand. So we rated it mostly false. Okay. Our next example. This is Raul Labrador, a congressman from Idaho, and he wrote an op-ed in the newspaper saying that arguing broadly against illegal immigration, but also arguing more specifically against people seeking asylum. And he said that immigrants should not cross the border. He said immigrants can show up at any embassy or consulate abroad to make their asylum claims. We rated this false. Now, again, I'm just inviting you to think for a minute. Where would you go to find out if this statement is true or not? For us, I have to say, when the reporters pitched me on potential facts to check, and she said, a reader emailed us and said this is wrong. I had no idea if it was right or wrong, but I said, go ahead, go for it. This was certainly a topic in the news. One of the criteria we use to pick facts to check are things that are in the news or not. So this one was rated false. Here's some of the reporting that we found. First, we were pointed by immigration experts to U.S. law, and we ascertained it for ourselves, and you can see there's a link that says any alien who is physically present in the United States or who arrives in the United States may apply for asylum. And this is what the law says, so it pretty much demands that they be physically present in the U.S. A U.S. consulate, when we consulted with our expert who said a U.S. consulate or embassy is clearly outside the U.S., so you can't apply for asylum at a consulate or an embassy. And this was the guy who served as chief counsel of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So we confirmed it with the statute, and then we ran it by an expert. Now, later on in the piece, we get into refugee status, which is a little bit different. There are refugees in other parts of the world who go through the United Nations and apply for refugee status, and then sometimes they come into the United States. When we asked Congressman Labrador about his reasoning, he said his response was, well, people should come through legal ports of entry to apply for asylum. They shouldn't cross the border. But the law says they can apply for asylum whether or not at a designated port of arrival. And his op-ed his statement wasn't about shoulds. He made a factual claim that was false. So we rated it false. So those are my three examples. Let me talk to you now about where we are with fact-checking, the current outlook. I try to be an optimist. It's not always easy. I think fact-checking is important for fact-checking's sake. But I have to tell you, we're in this moment of political polarization. I described it earlier, the two sides. not wanting to meet in the middle. We are right and you are wrong. I do not see what will improve this situation in the near term. I think the political polarization is going to continue and it may worsen. Misinformation on the internet is an ongoing problem. And we are partnering with Facebook. What that partnership entails is that Facebook works with fact checkers. They provide us with something that looks like a news feed, but it's content that's been flagged as suspicious. And we fact check that information and then provide our findings back to Facebook. They include that information in their algorithm to suppress news that's fake. Facebook made a decision to keep political information, like statements by congressmen or elected officials, out of this feed. So the feed is a lot of hoaxes and conspiracy theories from news websites that you probably haven't heard of. But we're fact checking this. We see a lot of misinformation pop up around news events. We did a lot of fact checks during the Kavanaugh hearings on both sides. Like we saw claims that Christine Blasey Ford was employed by a pharmaceutical company with connections to the abortion pill. That was not right. We saw photos circulated that claimed to be photos of a young inebriated Brett Kavanaugh. That was not right. But that's the kind of information that's created and passed around in these high-profile news moments. We just finished fact-checking the 2018 midterms. A couple of themes emerged there. We saw a lot of misinformation about immigration. We saw a lot of misinformation about health care, some about pre-existing conditions and where individual candidates stood on that. We also saw Donald Trump give a series of campaign rallies where he made a number of misstatements. And if you Google it, we have a story about his last week of campaign rallies and the misstatements he made. They tended to focus around immigration, saying things like Democrats were behind the caravan, saying that Democrats want to let in illegal immigrants and give them free benefits. And those statements we rated, they didn't do so well on the accuracy scale. Soon, the 2020 race will begin. The Democrats are looking to field a candidate to defeat Trump in the 2020 election, but there is not a clear frontrunner at this point. I think you will start seeing more Democrats declaring. We'll see them campaign through the early states like South Carolina. Definitely, I would expect them by next summer. It may even be earlier. I've seen some reports speculate that there may be as many as 20 or 30 candidates in that Democratic primary. We'll see. A year from now, we'll start seeing Democratic debates as they decide who's going to be their nominee. We're doing a few other things at Politifact that I just want to mention before we go to questions. One is MediaWise. We're doing a media literacy program for young people. And the program really pivots around these three questions when you see misinformation. Ask yourself, who is sharing the information? Ask yourself, what is their evidence? And then ask yourself, what are other people saying about it? This is a program that we're doing in conjunction with Stanford University. And they really emphasize that if you're trying to navigate information on the internet, seeing if it's accurate or not, you really want to do what they call lateral searching, which is not just taking the information at face value, but really searching who's behind the information and what is some of the reporting and commentary around it. And then this is my final slide. We do have our Truth Squad for people who are interested in supporting Politifacts' mission. This is that NPR-style campaign I mentioned. And then we also have a free weekly Politifact email that you can sign up for that I write every week. It's the best of Politifact each week. We have a commitment to keeping Politifact content free for the public. So there's no fee to sign up, and you can always go to Politifact and see any of our reports The Truth Squad helps us keep it free. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you so much, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you, Angie. That was wonderful. Okay, at this point, if you have questions, we have Katerina Moyan and I'm sure some other Dr. Disney who are available to take your questions. What I will be doing is now turning this over to Avery, who has prepared a few questions to get us started. And I will be pulling up the evaluation slide. So as you are listening and thinking about what kind of questions you would like to ask and listening to our conversation, please take a minute and complete our evaluation. Avery, take it away.
All right, thank you. First question, this is just for me. What is the difference when you're evaluating a claim between false and pants on fire?
We have developed definitions for our ratings, believe it or not, and they're actually quite helpful. So the definition is the statement is not accurate. And pants on fire is the statement is not accurate and makes a ridiculous claim. Now, whether something is ridiculous or not is honestly determined by the vote of the 3 editors.
And it sounded like in the example you used earlier, perhaps that politician was mistaken or misunderstood something. Does the intent factor into that as well?
That's a great question. Certainly if we contact the politicians before we publish, and if they say, oh, wow, I'm sorry, I got it wrong, it's hard not to take that into consideration. But we do try to stay away from the question of intent because we can't read their minds. We can't know whether, are they fabricating? I mean, we don't really know that. We can't know that. So we tend to just ruthlessly rate based on what the facts show. And if they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, we're like, well, it's nice that you're sorry, but you're still getting a false. So.
Gotcha. What is sorry, I'm going to bounce around a good bit here, but what is the topic that creates the most factually incorrect claims? You mentioned immigration. Is that the number one topic of discussion, or is there something else that just...
I would say the topic tends to be whatever is most contentious in U.S. politics at the moment. Like right now, it's immigration. During the drafting of the healthcare law, the Affordable Care Act, it was definitely healthcare. And there was a period during the Obama administration after it became clear that there would not be immigration legislation when we didn't fact check immigration that much. So the contested areas change with time. One of the things about being a fact checker is we definitely follow the political conversation. We try to fact check claims and topics that are in the news. We don't want to fact check a statement that no one's ever heard anybody talk about or say because we think relevance is important. So we definitely see the areas of fabrication kind of move around with the political conversation.
And that gets into my next question. What is the search process that you go through before deciding this is a claim worth fact checking? Is it editor driven? Is it reporter driven? Do you get tips from outside? And does it start with a hypothesis that this is a ridiculous claim? We need to look into this and find out whether it's true. How do you come from start to finish throughout that?
Right. It's really a mixture. We get a lot of reader tips, and we try to do reader suggestions whenever possible. Our readers give us really good ideas. It's hard to quantify, but I would say about a third of the fact checks we do are from reader ideas. Reporters are also looking for fact checks all the time and giving us ideas. I always prefer for the reporters to find their own fact checks and do them because I just think that if they're interested in it, they'll do a, everybody wants to work on the things they're interested in. So I like it when the reporters pitch things. Sometimes we editors decide and assign people things to fact check. We try to fact check what is in the news. I think more than anything else, we're driven by what's in the news. And I should say, we are not fact checking a random sample. We're not doing any kind of scientific method here. We call it the truthometer, but I think most people understand the truthometer is not an actual scientific instrument. We're fact-checking based on our own news judgment.
And obviously, President Donald Trump is keeping a lot of people in your profession busy of late. How do you decide which of the president's claims, many of which have been well documented by the Washington Post, other news outlets, to be misleading or false? Obviously, you can't keep up with all of them. How do you pick and choose your spots?
Right. We tend to look for things that sound wrong and that we think a lot of people will have heard. So we try to fact check most of his high-profile statements. We tend to fact check a lot of his campaign rallies. But there's no doubt we're not fact checking everything he said. We write reports for every fact check we do because we think it's really important to get deeply into the facts and into the nuance. The Washington Post, by contrast, has a project where they're counting every time they believe that President Trump has made a false or misleading statement. And I think they're up to like 5,000 or 6,000 statements. For us, I know we have fewer than 1,000 statements we've rated of President Trump. I believe it's in the 600 to 800 range right now. So we don't fact check everything that he says that is questionable. We try to stick to the important things, but sometimes he says something that's like in the grand scheme isn't that important, but just seems really wrong, and we'll fact check that too. And one more thing. I just think that the presidency is such a unique position in American politics that we fact-checked the president very intensely, and we fact-checked President Barack Obama very intensely. In fact, until President Trump took office, President Obama was the most fact-checked person on Politifact because we think whenever the president makes a public statement, it's really important that it gets scrutinized.
This one is from a student, or at least someone in the audience. I know you're not all students. This is a little off topic, but how do you think CNN will fare with its lawsuit against the presidency over the White House's decision to pull Jim Acosta's credential?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I don't know what the legal basis of the lawsuit is. So I'm not sure what their argument is. It's a tough one because I don't know how many of you saw it, but Acosta wouldn't give up his microphone. And he was being very aggressive in asking a question. I think it was shocking that someone's press credentials would be revoked for that, but I'm just not sure what legal basis how the legal claims are going to play out, because certainly there's a First Amendment right to report, but I think most journalists would agree that doesn't mean a journalist can go into the White House press room and behave any way they want. So then it kind of turns on this question of what was the White House thinks his behavior was really bad. I don't think it would be worth revoking a press credential over, but I think we'll have to see what the courts say.
Sure, it certainly doesn't make all journalists look good to have someone sort of behaving that way, but it's also questionable whether the White House should have revoked his credential.
Well, and one other thing that I would say is I think President Trump has gone out of his way to antagonize CNN. We did a story earlier in his presidency where we looked at how many times he had complained or insulted the media by name, and CNN was one of his top targets. So if this is a troubled relationship, I think it's certainly the president has contributed to it.
Sure. This student says that he or she read the Politifact report on the White House video of the Acosta incident. I don't know if you were directly involved with that one.
I was.
I personally watched both videos side to side. I have no idea. I couldn't spot the difference until I think someone made a version where one version was in red and the other version was normal. Mm-hmm. How did Politifact handle that case, and what were some of the variables that were in play as you were deciding how to evaluate that?
Just for those who didn't see the story, what happened so there was a press conference. Acosta, the CNN reporter, was asking a question, and he didn't want to let go of the microphone, and an intern came to physically grab the microphone away from him, and he was pulling to keep holding on to it. So this was being filmed. What happened was that later, Sarah Sanders tweeted a video of the incident where it was zoomed in on his hand. And if you look at the video, it looks kind of like he's like karate chopping the intern. And people said that this video was doctored. And that's what caught Politifact's attention. I don't know that we would have written about it otherwise until this claim of a doctored video was raised. So I assigned the report to one of our reporters, Manuela Tobias, and I said, see what you can find out about if this was doctored or not. Just, like we need to do some reporting. So she looked into it, and what she found was that the video that Sarah Sanders had tweeted was identical to a video that had been put together by InfoWars, which is a conspiracy website. And it's hard to say that whether the video has been doctored or not, but at a minimum, what happened is InfoWars took the video and they turned it into a GIF. Do you know what a GIF is? I know most of you do, but it's a little short version of a video that just plays over and over that you can share on the internet. Well, one of the things that makes GIFs shareable is that the video is compressed in the sense that it doesn't have all the frames of a normal video, and that's to make the file smaller so you can share it on the internet. So InfoWars makes this GIF. Well, then they take the GIF and they convert it back to a video because they want, like why they did that, I don't know. But they convert it back, it seems that they convert it back to a video. And when you take a GIF and convert it back to a video, the software inserts extra frames. And the software kind of interprets the limited frames of the GIF back into a regular speed video. No, this is in the weeds. Politifact lives in the weeds.
It's certainly not as sexy as claiming that the president doctored a photo himself and put it out.
It's not, but it seems like that is probably what happened. And because we couldn't say for sure, we did not issue a rating. We wrote a report that laid out all this so people could read it.
And that was going to be one of my questions. If you're 99% sure about something, if you're 85% sure, you think it's false, but you're not all the way there, do you just not write anything at all? Do you issue a softer rating that you would think? How do you handle those situations?
In practice, we do a couple of different things. If we're really not certain, we don't issue a rating. If we're really not certain and I feel really uncomfortable, we don't publish. But there's other cases where there's some information, but it's limited. And so sometimes those kinds of statements would get a half true. Partially accurate, but leaves out important context.
And this is a pretty tough question from the audience here, but this person writes, if the president can tell some 6,000 lies since his election and still retain support of many Americans and 90% of Republicans, does this not indicate the hopelessness of your cause?
It's heartless.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. I have to say, I have two different answers to that question. Number one is, I think fact-checking is worthwhile doing just for its own sake, just for the simple virtue of stating the truth. And I would do this I would be willing to do this kind of work even if, like, you could prove to me that it made zero difference. I would say some people are interested in the truth, and I am writing for them. We will lose our minds if we just say, like, nothing matters, might makes right, whatever. No, I'm not going to live that way. I'm going to fact check and say, like, this is true and this is not, even if nobody else cares. So that's my first answer. My second answer is the political universe is a really complicated place, and we really don't know, like, what works. I put works in quotes, like what works, what people get away with, what people don't get away with. I think that we all need to go out there and do our part in a democracy, and then but knowing that we can't know what makes a difference and what doesn't. I live in hope that Donald Trump will stop saying false things and will become more accurate. Now, maybe he won't. But I just think that I think it's simplistic to say he's what did they say? He's not getting, sorry.
You talking about indicate the hopelessness of your cause part?
Yeah,
or?
no, before that. Trump says 6,000 lies and then
yeah, and still retains support of many Americans and
still
90%
retains
of
support
Republicans.
of many Americans. Well, I think people make political decisions where a politician's accuracy isn't the most important factor. It's one factor of several. But on the factor of accuracy, I want people to be able to come to a place like Politifact and be informed.
Obviously, Politifact is nonpartisan, and you guys try to do your best to make sure everyone understands that you're as transparent as you possibly can be. But when Republicans control, as they did the last 2 years, all three major both houses of Congress and the White House, and you find yourself fact-checking the president hundreds of times, do you ever feel like you have to go after a Democrat here or there just to show that you're going after both sides? Is that ever part of the equation?
We go after Democrats on a regular basis just because that's what we should do. I mean, I do think we have a commitment to being independent journalists. So if you want to be perceived as an independent journalist, you have to act like one, and that means fact-checking both sides. Now, what we don't do is say, oh, it's Monday, we got a false for Trump. Let's see if we can go find a false for Nancy Pelosi. Because that's not what we're doing here. We've used the analogy of an umpire who is calling balls and strikes at a baseball game. He doesn't say oh, I just called 2 strikes for the Red Sox, let me call 2 for the Yankees. They just call them like they come over the plate, and that's what we're trying to do.
Where do you see, how can journalists, obviously there's this feeling of broken trust between journalists and major institutions and just regular people. How can journalists specifically repair that trust and go back to an era, if it's possible, where they're more respected and more trusted, given the benefit of the doubt by the American people? Yeah,
that's such a great question, and it's a really tough one to answer because the media is so diverse. A Politifact comes out of the print newspaper tradition. You're a print news reporter. I think we do a lot of things right as far as sourcing and independence and transparency. When I talk to people in the public and I hear complaints about the media, most often they're talking about cable news. And I would say that's like a whole different beast from what we're doing. There's a lot of problems right now with cable news and it's driven by the market and turning a profit. So I would urge journalists to make sure that they have some humility. I think especially in politics, journalists sometimes behave very arrogantly, and I think that never helps us. But I also think journalism is a job that you can't go into expecting pats on the back all the time. I think there's a book that I have, it's titled Democracies Need an Unlovable Press, and I think that if we're doing our job, we're informing people. And people don't always it's sometimes we have good news, sometimes we have bad news.
What do you tell people this is just one that literally came in as you were speaking, but what do you tell people who say that all journalists are fake news, or who say they would never believe anything they would read in the newspaper or see on TV?
Well, I think that's absurd. Because
pants on fire, mostly false.
Well, yeah. All journalism is fake news. Well, what? Then we live in a fantasy world where everything is. On some level, I think that reality will assert itself. I do encourage people to engage with a media they trust on a regular basis. So pick a newspaper or a news website that you like and that you feel has good information, and read it regularly. I tell people, we've got basically 4 national newspapers that I think are all very good. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the USA Today. And I think, like, if people who are conservative can read the Wall Street Journal, people who are liberal might like the New York Times. And I also highly recommend the PBS NewsHour. I think they are working really hard to be even-handed. But this idea that everything is fake news, I mean, like, that just doesn't even make any sense. Like, how could society function if everything was fake news? I mean, we'd be in some kind of Orwellian dystopia. I think. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, I would hope so. So I remember the day after the 2016 election, everybody ran to Facebook. There were all of these comments about fake news dominated this election. Everyone was confused by fake news. To an extent, I think even Mark Zuckerberg has admitted that fake news did have a role. It's why Facebook has hired you guys, I assume.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think fake news is still prevalent? Is it still a problem that we need to be actively combating? And if so, how do we do that as a society, not just as journalists?
Right. I think we are still seeing fake news. And when I say fake news, I'm talking about fabricated reports that are intended to deceive. That's my definition of fake news. I think we are still seeing some of it. I think a lot of it is because of this new technology called the internet. We haven't worked out the methods for determining authenticity and credibility. And if you look at history, they had some of these same issues, like when the printing press was invented. I mean, like, none of us were alive back then, but people were really freaked out that you could print books and print whatever you wanted. And there was like, how do we know what to believe? So I think some of this is a new technology. I think some of the technology companies need to take more responsibility for what's disseminated on their platforms. I think Facebook has been pretty good at trying to deal with the problem. I mean, they got a ton of bad publicity, and I'm sure that's why. But they've instituted this program. They're trying to do stuff. Whereas Twitter just now seems to be just starting to enforce their own policies. I think Twitter has a lot of problems, and I think YouTube has some problems too. As a society, I would say think before you share. I would say try to, if you feel like you're a very partisan person or you have these partisan leanings, try to check yourself before you indulge in them. I see people sharing fake news out of anger and fear. So whenever you see news that activates those emotions, just be really careful. You might be being subject to fake news, or it might even be real news, and it's just something that's like that is aimed at demonizing other people. I don't think it's great when Americans look at other Americans and say, that's my enemy. And boy, I hear that so much more than I used to. I mean, even in just socially, people who are like, oh, wow, they're the other party. Blah. It's like, that doesn't help. That helps nothing. In fact, it probably harms the democratic process.
Obviously, I think a lot of students are here to get class credit or to fulfill some sort of requirement. You don't have to identify yourselves. But potentially for that crowd or for people who are interested in journalism, why should they go into journalism? Why should they consider that as a profession? Obviously, there's a lot of reasons that people would say you shouldn't.
Oh, yeah.
But why should people be inspired to go into journalism in this era?
Well, I can tell you why I went into journalism, and that's because I was curious about the world. And it seemed like a wonderful way to learn about the world we live in. And I like to write. And it's just, I am so grateful for my career. It's been really, I just love journalism. I love finding out about the world. I love being able to write up reports and tell people what I learned. And Politifact, I have to tell you, has just been a blast for the past 11 years. And like, sometimes some of my friends ask me like, when are you going to do something besides this fact checking thing? And I'm just kind of like, what could I be doing that's better than this? I mean, I'm fact checking the U.S. government at a really exciting time in history. So I would say I still recommend journalism to young people, but you really have to have a passion for it, because it's hard work. You'll get criticized. You won't make a ton of money. But if you have a passion for it, it's just one of the best jobs I think a person could have.
All right, so tell us a war story. What is the greatest links you've gone to, or that one of your reporters has gone to actually fact check a claim?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. When you said war story, my first thought was thinking about press secretaries screaming at me because they didn't like our fact check, but which happens sometimes. But the greatest lengths we've gone to. One of our most ambitious projects was a project to fact check global health. We got a grant from the Gates Foundation, and they were concerned that that the media wasn't doing enough writing about global health issues, so things like malaria and AIDS. And they gave us a grant, and they said, fact check whatever you want, just these are the topics that we're giving you this grant for. So we sent 3 of our journalists to Africa to work with a group called Africa Check. And they fact-checked all kinds of things about malaria, about the spread of malaria, about global wealth, global poverty, and that was really good. That was some really good work we did. I would also say our fact-checking of the healthcare law was pretty intense. I was a reporter then, and I read the various versions of the healthcare law, and they were like, woo. They were tough. Some of those were tough reading. The Senate bill was very tough reading. The House bill made some more sense. So, and like, I told my editor at the time, this was when I was a reporter, I was like, I need 3 days to read this House bill and digest it and fact check it. So we do stuff like that. Lately, it just, one of the things about partisan polarization is that, like, a lot of the fact checks don't take a whole lot of work to debunk. They just take some thought, some looking at the research, a couple of phone calls to experts. I'm surprised at how many false statements are pretty easily debunked. And I think that goes to the fact that, like, we do not live in a particularly accurate information environment right now.
And what's been your favorite fact check you've ever done? Last question. So that was the hardest. What's been your favorite or your most gratifying or the one you just like the most?
Oh, wow. That's a kind of a hard question. What's the fact check I've liked the most?
I clearly did not prepare you for this before. These are not softballs.
No. I will tell you, I recently wrote a story that I love doing. This was not a fact check, but I don't get to write very often, but when I do, I really enjoy it. And this summer, I read a biography of George Washington by a guy named Ron Chernow, who's also the guy who wrote Hamilton, the Hamilton biography. Well, this biography of George Washington just fascinated me. And the thing that I wrote about was, like, even back then, there was fake news. When George Washington was president, some people forged these letters that were supposedly from George Washington to Martha Washington and to his some other friends and relatives. And it's George Washington saying, this whole American Revolution, I don't know about this. I don't think it's going to work. Maybe it would be better if we stayed under the king. And these letters were forged and circulated to try and undermine Washington and say he didn't really believe in the American Revolution. And Washington knew about the letters, and they would pop up every so often. So they were first during the Revolution, but they followed him. And on the last day of his presidency, he wrote a letter to the Secretary of State, and the letter's still in the National Archives. And he debunked the fake letters because the fake letters were supposedly found in this stolen briefcase, and George Washington was like, there was no stolen briefcase. None of my belongings were ever stolen. These letters are totally fake. And I just really liked that because it kind of got me out. It just reminded me that, like, a lot of these issues we've always had with us, and we just have to keep fact checking, keep asserting what is true and what is not, and it just made me hopeful. So.
Great. Well, at least it's not just us that are having the problem with with post-fact world here. It's always kind of been like this to a certain degree. So thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Incredibly, our hour together has just sped by. So please let us thank both Avery and Angie for a wonderful conversation.